Hello, you are watching The Rebel Nutritionist with me, Meryl Braun, and I'm the owner of the Braun Institute for Nutrition and Wellness, a holistic wellness center located in South Florida. I help my clients ditch diet fads and uncover the real truth about how food can truly heal your life. I know that together we can help you feel great. I'm excited to show you the way to long-term healthy living. So let's dive in and get started. All right. Hey, everyone. I'm your host, Meryl Braun, and this is the show that shows you how to be your best self through nutrition, movement, exercise, emotional well-being. So today I am really excited to introduce a very special guest and a friend of mine, Dr. Braun. Tao and I go way back. Tao, how many years? I don't know, 15 years?
Yeah, I was going to say 15, probably 15 more.
Yes, so let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Braun. He is the Executive Director of the Violence Prevention Agency, and he is a subject matter expert on the prevention of violence during the crisis, the COVID crisis that's going on now, but also in a strategic response to, how do you want to say that? I mean,
yeah, I wish there was a one word that sums it up. And people always ask me, for the elevator pitch of what I do. And an hour later, when we're talking about mass casualty attacks and mass casualty incidents and school safety, I think that the word that highlights it all is prevention. You and I met in a wellness space, and I see wellness as being prevention in terms of keeping yourself in the best possible state, so that if you can hopefully fight off something, but if you do land up getting ill or having an injury, you've got the best chance of making it through really nicely. And my work is an intersection of that as it relates to safety and as it relates to working with people to training for their worst day of their lives so that they can be their best. And so during this crisis, I started looking at what are people going to need, both on the civilian side and then also in the emergency management side. And I've got to say that something that was different about this slow-moving mass casualty incident is because it wasn't affecting certain states at the beginning. The industry, the emergency management folks were slow to react in the way that they would if this was a natural disaster, for example, where they have mutual aid and everything set up. But they're doing a phenomenal job now and really working together. And as you can see, the response has changed across the country.
Yeah. So so the other thing that I want to mention is that you also are leading a team of scientists in developing 2 COVID antiviral disinfectant strategies. It's a non-toxic, biodegradable, long-lasting antiviral disinfectant and anti-inflammatory, and it's an antioxidant. And these are things that we're not going to address in this, you and I were just talking, we're not going to address in this particular podcast, but I definitely want to make sure that we are going to talk about that in an upcoming one because we have lots to get to. So welcome, and I appreciate you doing this.
Thank you.
So before we walk into or dive into the work with COVID and kind of elaborate more on what you were saying, what do you see yourself in terms of the prevention in the front lines of fighting a invisible attacker like COVID?
Yeah. Well, I think that it changes daily. And I think that that's part of the overlap between emergency management. There's always a responsibility to bring people in different roles, the best information. And I think in a world where everything is so super fast, I describe it as we went from making popcorn in a on top of a stovetop, and you had to wait and you had to get the just right, and it would burn really quickly, but it wouldn't be a super quick because you would be there watching it. And then we all, our generation was the microwave popcorn, and those first bags that came out, you would open it up and it was like a nuclear flame that came to you, and they had warnings all over it about how, the thermal intensity of how this thing could burn you. But then we live in a world where there's an expectation now where everything is instant, right? And that's the world where you open up a bag of popcorn and it's ready, and people will even tolerate it cold because it's flavored well, and that's the expectation. I want it now and I'm going to have it now. Information is not like that. And so I think part of what is sort of interesting about around this crisis is there's an intersection between patience in solving the problem and wanting key information, which everybody obviously needs right now. And it can get really confusing because, let's look at even mask wearing, right? So information will come out and people will say there isn't any benefit. And the next day, another giant organization will say there's extreme benefit. And then that same organization, will then dial that back. And then the other organization will find new research. And that's been very confusing for people. And I think people should see that as not political, in as much as that is what happens during crisis with information, that it goes back and forward. And eventually, over time, best practices emerge. What can people do for themselves in the meantime? Stay informed, stay open to other people's opinion, prevent rigidity with thinking, because if there is new information, you need to be able to change. You can always tell I love metaphors, I love visualizing things, and it's the same as driving. You can be on a completely dry surface, then the next thing you're driving through water. So it changed in an instant, and you have to change with it and be okay with it, right?
Yeah, and I think one of those, not to interrupt you, but one of the points that I want to bring up is that originally, and you've been on the front lines about this, right, when it comes to COVID, that it was originally labeled as respiratory disease, but you and I have had many conversations. Is it really initially the respiratory disease or not? Is it gastrointestinal? I think, again, we're learning, like you say, the more information that comes out. Remember, this is so new that we're still gathering information. And and you and I especially, right, as information comes out, we're trying to stay on top of it in whether it's the prevention, the dealing, the managing of it when you've got it, and then the recovery. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. But talk a little bit about your research with the respiratory versus the gastrointestinal and bring us into that.
So in the world of threat management, one of the things we try and do is past behavior predicts future behavior. And so I wanted to know, how did coronavirus, SARS-1, act in the past? What research was there? That my original thought process of bringing myself to speed with what's happening, what does this attacker do, was to look at its impact. And so I could look very quickly at some of the early Wuhan studies that came out. And then also having a look at, looking at this attacker, how did it behave in the past? And it might not repeat exactly, but past behavior predicting future behavior told me things around COVID in terms of SARS-1 and SARS-2. So the first thing that caught my attention is I went to look at the original Wuhan research, and I found, yes, like most places in the world, people were having a hard time breathing, and a lot of people deceased because they couldn't breathe, right? And so that obviously labels it a respiratory disease. The thing is, it's an oversimplification, because all illnesses, all injuries that are moving towards being dead end in a breathing issue. Like that is the end point of life, right? We start with the first breath, we end with the last breath. So of course we have to include the fact that the lungs are going to be majorly impacted, and at the end point of someone's struggle, it's going to be respiratory. But that doesn't mean that's where it starts. That doesn't mean that it starts like that for everybody. And so what caught my attention is the missing piece out of the Wuhan studies, were that people were waiting too long to come and get help. And a lot of people, up to 30% in some of the studies, were coming in and they were dehydrated. They were given the term anorexic, which is different from the psychiatric or psychological term anorexia. It just means this person was starving, that they were unable to eat. They hadn't eaten. Some people it had been up to 7 days, 10 days of not eating. And you think to yourself, well, that's really, really serious. And we know that basically you can't go for much time without water. You can go for a fair amount of time without food, but then the two start becoming side by side. Starvation is and dehydration are a big part of this illness. And so what was happening is people were coming in too late. They were dehydrated. And so that got me thinking about looking, what does SARS-1 do? And what I found with SARS-1 as a virus is that SARS-1 attacked both because it attacks epithelial, and I shouldn't use even the word attack. It attaches, and there's involvement with the epithelial cells, and epithelial cells are all over the body, and so they can test to see where this particular virus likes attaching. And where does it like attaching? In SARS-1, it liked attaching on colon cells more than lung cells. SARS-2, the research has shown that it's a 50-50 split, which means what are we doing and what are we thinking about all the people that land up getting this disease or fighting this disease, and it's gastric primarily, or gastric first going into respiratory. It's a really odd thing to think about, but we talk about breathing in particles, let's say, right? But where that splits, it goes down into the gut as well as into the lungs. So It makes sense to think about what is happening with the gut. And that's what took me into looking really, really early on, what can we do from a preventative side for gut health?
Right. And that's part of what I've been talking about, or much of what, I've been talking about over the past few months after even this conversation that you and I had, and I started looking at it, and I'm saying, okay, part of the prevention is definitely making sure that we are seeing improvements or managing people's gut health. And we know so many people are walking around with, and it could be mild. It could be things like IBS, which for some people are mild or some people are major, which is sort of a catch-all term for an upset stomach, right? A nervous stomach. So it could be anything from IBS to reflux to colitis to Crohn's disease, and and the list goes on. Even SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, right? Any of those GI disorders are going to predispose you to higher rates of illness or more severe illness, because we also know that 80%, 85% of your immune system is in your intestines, right? Throughout your entire body. So a lot of the work, and I've been talking about, we've got videos and we've been doing interviews all on how to support gut health through fermented foods, through root vegetables, the whole piece of people staying away from carbs and avoiding carbohydrates, yet root vegetables, which are carbohydrate, loaded, are some of the best foods to support gut health. Yeah. And so I think we really need to take a step back, and instead of looking at this, and I've said before, as a diet mentality, like, oh, I don't want to eat those things because I don't want to gain weight. We need to really look at it from a health supportive and a nutritionally supportive place. Like, am I doing things, best practices, as you say, to keep myself healthy? And I think one of the things, when we talk about prevention that is just not highlighted enough as well is this whole obesity epidemic. We wonder why we are having the highest rates of mortality from COVID, right? Yes. And we know the research shows obesity is a huge risk factor. Bill Maher spoke about it. I am going to repost his replay on that because it was phenomenal. You and I have talked about that. So
I think something that comes up for me often around the topic of how obesity relates to this is, I think that in some sort of cruel way, when it was said that the sort of three main things that predispose this are going to, either people are going to struggle or die from this, and obesity was thrown out there, and cardiovascular disease and diabetes, I think that there was a lot of burden immediately on sort of like, well, if somebody gets this and they die, it's their fault. And I think that there's been some sort of stigma reasons that there was also a lack of awareness that the healthiest people can get this and struggle. I think that because there was sort of this category thrown out there, that people would go, well, you know, I'm high risk because I've got some cardiovascular issues, but I should be okay because I'm managing that. And then for somebody who's been struggling and they're either overweight or obese, there was a feeling like, well, I can't do anything anyway. I've been struggling with this with my whole life, so it's going to get me regardless. I'm not going to be able to get away from that. So there's a sort of learned helplessness that comes with that. And then on the diabetes front, it's the same thing, where if somebody is either maintaining their diabetes or is struggling with it, it's like, okay, so what am I going to do about that? And I think what that did is it split the category of healthy people, kids as well. You know, they talked about the elderly at some point as well. Well, there's people that are, you know, I read about somebody, I think she was like 100 or 101. And she got COVID and she fought through it. You know, she's got a different system than the people that are predisposed to this. I think what's going to be really interesting eventually is around being able to really look at the genetic part of that, about this. And the overlap for me is going to be that when the science catches up, we're going to see things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, having such a strong genetic link to metabolic illness and how much of that science is going to change. And I think that at that point that we'll also see the overlap that essentially this becomes a metabolic illness, that it starts off as a virus that gets into a system. Its whole aim is literally just to replicate. And in doing that, it's disruptive. Like, it is really, really disruptive. And I think it is disrupting all of the biome health, the micro gut health, everything that you have been doing for years, I think is really key here in terms of prevention and response. I think a lot of the long-term impact, and I encourage people to turn to people like you and to the science of nutrition to be able to go, okay, so this is a little bit like a natural disaster, an earthquake, a flood, a fire, right? If you think about, I'm going to break down the point to it of looking at inflammation as fire, right? If your gut is a forest and there's been a major forest fire, it makes sense that everything's going to need to regrow. What happens while it's regrowing? People are going to feel horribly ill because they don't have that gut health. Yeah. So let's look at the part where if it would be like an earthquake, that would be like shock, right? So even though the shock is over, well, they're going to have relapses just like an earthquake. You're going to have those aftershocks. So someone can be okay for 2 weeks. Suddenly they're not okay for 3 days. Everything is back. That's an aftershock. Let's look at it in terms of the diarrhea component. Right? So if somebody has gone through a flood, right, that can often be left with devastation that turns into drought because of erosion. So you can make these comparisons and you can see how food and nutrition is going to play this role. And, let's do this. I think for people that are watching this, and this might be, sort of life-changing and life-saving for them. Why don't I turn this back on you for a second and give somebody, not thinking about a quick fix, but some of the most important things that they can do right now that can lead to that gut health coming back.
Yeah, I mean, and you made a great point, just to go back to what you were saying in terms of people feeling helpless and sort of this learned helplessness with what the diseases are. And I think that's really the highlight of the difference between what conventional medicine does and functional medicine, and people don't seem to, they can't grasp sort of the difference. And so rather than band-aiding, let's say, with a medication, which in certain circumstances, look, I'm not bashing conventional, right? We know from illnesses, it's important. And so I'm not bashing it. But really, if we want to look at long-term health and chronic conditions like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all of these metabolic diseases, we really need to look at root cause. How did I get here in the first place, right? What sort of made my body, whether you're talking about, the inflammation or any of this, what predispose me to some of these illnesses, right? So looking at the immune system, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the same, looking back even at the genetics and the genomics, which is really my passion as of late in terms of really looking at people's genetics, because, and I think when my first podcast was on really talking a little bit about what genomic nutrition is and really understanding it is the biochemistry of how things, interplay in our body and how we use that to support health. So, going back to like what you're saying, what can people do now proactively? Stress, right? Stress right now, everybody is stressed, and stress causes a tremendous amount of inflammation, whether it's physical stress or emotional stress, it causes inflammation in the body. So even things that are simple like breath work, right? Doing deep breathing, which is not necessarily nutrition, but it's certainly in the overall big picture of health. So doing breath work, but making sure that, I talk about sugar all the time, taking sugar and processed foods out of the diet and replacing it with whole real foods. Like I said, for gut health, for the starchy carbohydrates, fermented types of foods, foods that are high in things like your vitamin C, and even getting out in the sun and being outside. Vitamin D, we know, is implicated in supporting health through COVID. Making sure you're hydrated, keeping that electrolyte balance, because we do know dehydration is an issue. And that's so the minerals, sodium, potassium, calcium, all of those, magnesium, zinc, right? All of those minerals, and of course copper, which will be the highlight of one of our other podcasts, but all of those minerals play a huge role in supporting health. But if we are eating foods that are packaged and processed, that come out of a bag, that haven't been prepared by us, we are really missing that huge nutritional component. And and that's the other part of this, where people, I think, look, I've talked to many clients who are saying, well, I'm cooking more now and I feel a difference and I feel better. How do we make that sustainable for them? And that's the work, that I'm trying to do, is really making prevention sustainable and realistic for people. So,
well, I mean, and I can't emphasize enough, like, I think it's so important. Like, a lot of my way of thinking, 15 years later, was shaped by your teaching and the way that you teach people to prepare food, and that you paired it. A fascinating thing that we can do in another podcast is literally the answer of all of the minerals that you just talked about are on the Passover Seder plate, right? As a cure and prevention for viruses. Like, it is, when COVID happened, and it was, I remember going through some of the nutritional value of the different foods on the Passover plate. And my wife and I, we were just like, wait, that's crazy. Parsley has this. And a lot of my research is pointing to the importance of albumin as part of this. And so there's there's a hard-boiled egg on that plate as a reminder of that your body needs certain proteins to be able to grow, a different type of connective tissue. And so I think a fascinating part would be to make that link for people, of that the supplement and the food that you're eating is not just sort of a hokey strategy, but a lot of the medicines that people are taking, the root of them is from those things anyway, right?
Exactly.
And I sort of started off a career in the wellness industry with, I had my own bias, and I would say that my bias was pretty anti-conventional medicine. And I'd got myself to the point where I think the breath work and Tai Chi and supplements and sort of being so, diehard in all of that way really left me thinking that there was this only way. And this was, there wasn't anything integrative in my approach, because I'd pushed away all of the science that was making it easy. If you want to get to a certain ingredient that comes from the bark of a tree in India, well, good luck getting on a flight in the middle of a pandemic to go strip off the bark, find somebody who knows the practice from 2,000 years ago that can turn it into a functional medicine for you. Or you can get it from the lab, who has a facility in New Jersey that produces thousands of tablets from that ingredient, right? So they really do work together. And another interesting sort of metaphor that I think is helpful for people to see how to integrate both approaches is somebody can, go out and they can have the best, all-terrain vehicle, the most amazing 4x4, it's equipped with all kinds of stuff, and they're driving along a highway and they think that they've got it all, and they're competing, as an all-terrain vehicle. And then they get to the edge of a dock, right? And so somebody else jumps out of their vehicle and into a boat, starts winning the race. And because it's not an all, everything fixes. There's a time to have something that goes in water, and there's a time to have something that goes on land. And I think about it in the same way that these two sort of ways, or not even two, many, many ways to fix the problem really do integrate together. I think that the prevention side of this has been left out. I really am not hearing a lot besides disinfecting. And even then, my discussions now with the EPA are going to be trying to understand the difference between fast-killing products and slow-killing products. Because sometimes you need a really fast solution. And sometimes, just like the world we're living in now with police reform, for example, we want an approach that's slower. We want people to de-escalate. We want people to talk somebody out of a suicide. So it's the same thing even with living with microorganisms. You don't necessarily want to kill everything around while you're killing one particular virus or stopping one particular virus. And so I think that this way of thinking is a balance that we're trying to achieve between what comes before, what comes while you're working with it, and where do you want that to go as a long-term response. I've got to say that something that I'm sort of concerned about is in our reality to end this pandemic, we are not going to do it successfully unless we think of our future.
Right.
We're not, in walking through New York City, I am concerned at the amount of masks that are just lying around the street. And that gives me an indication of how many of them are actually being thrown away at the moment. And so we also have to look at sustainable practices because we want a future. So the same thing with disinfecting. There are some disinfectants that you need to sterilize medical equipment, but that's not going to work in a school where kids are going to be breathing that in with tiny little lungs the whole day, or people with compromised immune systems. So I think that when it comes to the sort of integrative approach of prevention and then response, we've got to see how those two work together. Now, just before it goes out of my mind, I want to bring you back to, you mentioned potassium. And I think that something that I really want people to hear very loudly is that I think a excellent strategy that people can be doing right now, and you mentioned it, is hydration. And I think that what I'm hearing from paramedics is that because people are waiting too long, they're terrified of the hospital, or they call in for a telemedicine discussion with their doctor, and their doctor says, okay, let's send you for a test. Let's wait to see what the test is. Well, some tests are taking 7 days, right? So if you are not eating well, or if you have had some mild diarrhea at the beginning, you might think you're hydrating because you're drinking water. Water is not going to have those electrolytes in it that you mentioned. And I think because the diarrhea ends very quickly for a lot of people, they are not thinking about this in terms of putting back things like potassium and salts. And I think that the science is going to show us in the future that that has caused heart attacks and strokes in some people, because electrolytes, as you can speak to, are absolutely vital in our system to be able to function. Is there anything else that you wanted to say that you're seeing from clients that are either fighting this or recovering? And are there any anecdotal stories that you can share that have worked?
I mean, I think overall, I think, the interesting thing is the hydration part is huge, and the dehydration part is huge. And yes, I'm seeing a lot of that in terms of even during and in recovery. And even what you said about this whole integrative approach of where we're at is, I think we as in the global we, right, tend to be very reactive rather than proactive. And that again talks about prevention. And, you know, we have got to have a paradigm shift. If this isn't enough to push that, I don't know what would be. But really an understanding, like you said, there's got to be a prevention part of this. There's got to be, how do we deal with this? And then the recovery. For so many people, it's, oh, you know, they're terrified of getting it. Yes, we are all terrified, but what do I do if I do get it, and how do I deal with it? And then how do I recover? And you know, you had talked about that both on a personal level and a society, as a culture. We have got to recover from this. I will tell you, the amount of adults and even children, what really scares me are the kids who are dealing with anxiety now because of the implications of what's gone on. How are we dealing with mental health? And that could be, you know, of course, a whole nother topic. But nutrition, right? Nutrition ties into all of that, and I really just want people to try and flip a switch of, this is about health. This is not about finding the right diet. This is not about, if you're obese, just needing to lose weight. It's, if I have any of these issues, if I have metabolic disease, what do I need to do to make myself healthy, not thin? And that is a really, really important message that I want to hit. And I think, you know, going back to your point about what am I seeing from people, I think people just want information on how to get better, right? And is there an overlying, I think just improving nutrition, just even one thing, right? I tell people, change one habit. So, you know, whether it is, yes, electrolytes, and it's not going out and getting Gatorade, right? I mean, it's not, it's, you can make some chicken soup, and you make a batch of chicken soup, probably is the best hydration that you can get, right? You get even a little bit of orange juice, right? You get a little bit of orange juice and dilute it in water. You get a little bit of coconut water and dilute it in water. I'm not saying go drink a whole 16 ounces, because that's way too much sugar, right? We don't need that much. I mean, yeah, can we go out and get, I would caution
people. I'm gonna say that for a lot of people, what I would say, and it's not to push a brand here, but I think that looking at very subtle hydration, and there are tons of companies that make hydration, but there are also, I mean, the first place that I learned how the importance of hydration was working in clinics in Africa, where the same thing happens there, where if a clinic is only open on a Saturday and a little baby, you know, lands up getting diarrhea on a Monday, they are waiting the entire week to go and get help, and it's too late. And it leads to a lot of the mortality rates, the early deaths in places like Africa. So there are solutions that people can make for themselves, that they can jump online and find a hydrator for cholera that has a little bit of sugar, because as you've said, you know, something like Gatorade is made to be a sports hydrator. Well, people are not, you know, they're not out there on a football field needing to put back. Well, first of all, you never need that amount of sugar, as you and I both know. But if you're burning calories and you're out there, at least the body can deal with it, as compared to somebody who's fatigued and now you're pumping all that sugar into them. The other thing that why I'd say you're right about, you know, it's, and not to bash Gatorade, but why Gatorade is not useful is a ton of research is coming out about acidity as it relates to SARS-2. And so all of this stuff around trying to bring down acidity and sugar related to acidity. I hate to say this, and this is going to highlight the point, but I talk in extremes because I think it really helps people to put research into practice. Sadly, when we talked about obese people, a lot of the obese are actually dying from aspirating on acid. Literally, they are used to throwing up. You know, it's an issue with reflux. It's an issue with things like GERD. But a lot of the people don't have anyone around them, and they are so fatigued that they are not waking up from you know, getting a little bit of acid, a little bit of I hate to be graphic of it, a little bit of vomit, and they're breathing it into their lungs. And you can imagine that doesn't take much in terms of then changing all of the terrain within the lungs. And so acidity is going to become the thing that people are going to be flocking to doctors for. People, I'm reading on a ton of recovery groups about people struggling with reflux, heartburn, indigestion after food, And so now is the best time for people to learn about low acidity diets, about, green juices and things that their body can tolerate. And once again, I'm going to remind, as I said that, I'm always going to remind myself, it's not there's no template. So what creates acidity, like green juice is going to create acidity for me, a steak is not. So everybody should work out really quickly what it is for them that creates acidity in their body. For a lot of people, it might be nuts and legumes in terms of the oxalates. So they should ask these questions. Here's the thing, though, and it's not to bash medical doctors. You and I both know that it's people like you that have the specialty, not an MD. An MD knows the basics. They might be really well informed, but they're not going to be able to build a diet for somebody that says you can't tolerate almonds and cashews, but for somebody else that's really healthy. That's just not their specialty. So I really do want to promote people like yourself, and this kind of thinking is going to be crucial for people going forward. That's the recovery piece, right? To try to work out what has happened to someone's body, and to complete my metaphor around natural disasters. I threw out earthquake and drought and rain and floods and what's the other one I mentioned? Fire. Okay, I'm going to throw out another one that is a metaphor that's closely matched as a global emergency, that's closely matched to this as a slow-moving catastrophe, and that's acid rain. Right? The idea that if a system gets out of balance, there's too much acid. So once again, there's a sync here between emergency management in the things people have to deal with. You're not going to feel acid rain. You're not going to feel a corrosive spill out of a hazmat truck immediately. But if it gets into the water, like an oil spill, you're going to feel it for years, and you're going to be doing cleanup for years. So I think that's also very scary. That's the psychological part that you spoke about in terms of the recovery for people is going to be very challenging unless we can all realize that we're here to help those people, because they're not going to feel better in a week. It might take months. For some people, it might take years, and we're going to have to be there for them so that they don't feel rushed, because that type of recovery, as you and I know, you can't rush it. It is what it is.
And some of it, and that is a great point, and I love those metaphors. But yeah, and we probably should wrap up because you and I can go on with this. But sure. I do love that metaphor, and I love the idea of really, we do need to think a little bit out of the box with this. We do need to be, I think the take-home message is proactive, but not fear-based, right? That all of this can be handled and mitigated in the best, most natural way that we can. With using being able to lean on experts like yourself and like myself, and not just saying, there's a Band-Aid. Everybody's waiting for the vaccine. I'm not saying a plus or minus, right? But I don't want to throw all our eggs in that basket, because that's not the answer, right? Yes, a vaccine would certainly help the situation for so many people, but then for others it may not. And I'm not, it's again, not one way or the other on that. But what I'm saying is I don't want to throw all our eggs in one basket, because we do have to still look at prevention, management, and recovery in the global scheme of it all. And being able to go back to the research and understanding what is the collective research, and it'll continue to come, and we'll continue to try and decipher that and have these discussions. But I think for now, that wraps it up pretty well in terms of I think what we're looking at. And I love this conversation, and it's been so informative, as all of my conversations with you always are. And I look forward to our next discussion on copper. We'll have to get that.
Likewise, and I really thank you for your work. And I think that when I think about the sort of expertise and the compassion and patience that has to come with this style of recovery, I think that you're such a good role model as a human being for what that's going to look like and feel like for people. So anybody watching this, I really just want to encourage, go out there and find Meryl and find people like Meryl. I would say that just like anything else, there's now the usefulness of technology, so that people can reach out to people like you online, do telemedicine. But I also don't want to create a world where there's a nutritionist down the street from this person, and that we create this world where it feels safer now for everybody just to do telemedicine. Go and see the people. It's one of those things like, this is another way of being local. This is another way of supporting your local farm, right? You have people in your community that people can go and see and connect with. But I think that ultimately for me, I just want to thank you for doing this, for continuing on the dialogue, for always your willingness to put time to me throwing out crazy ideas and asking you, well, how would that work, and why is it that, how does that work together? But also importantly, I think the willingness to show people that they don't have to make these choices. I love the way that you spoke about vaccines, which is a very touchy topic for people. But a vaccine essentially is helping your body in a small, non-injurious dose to learn how to respond to something. But it can't respond to it without the things in your body that help a response.
Exactly.
So even a vaccine is a teaching tool for your body to say, go grab this. You're going to need to have more zinc in your system. Go grab the zinc. Your body's going to say, now's the time to draw a higher dose of insulin, flood the body with insulin. But if it's not there, then so they really do work together. And I think that that's such an excellent point, at least on my side, to wrap up with, of how they integrate.
Yes, and that's what it's all about. So thank you again. Appreciate your wisdom, and I look forward to the next one. And enjoy your time in your beautiful cabin there.
Thank you. It's another one of those things where I can say it's all about having resources. So I'm up here in the mountains because a friend has gone away. Our friends have gone away, and for me, when you mentioned about breath work, and that's not nutrition, yes it is. Breathing, air, putting, and the other thing, as you always do, you remind me of some of the most important things. One of the things that the original Wuhan study showed me, and this will be my key to, as soon as we hit stop, I'll go and move, and I'll go and get some fresh air. And that is also a reminder. I came across research the other day that in the first year of retirement, when people change from a very active lifestyle, getting up each day, putting their socks on, putting on your clothes, getting to work, driving, to getting out of the car, when people actually stop those subtle behaviors, there is a huge risk for stroke and heart attacks in the first year of retirement. So even during a pandemic, people need to be getting out. They need to be creating routine. They need to be moving. And so with that, I'm going to go enjoy a little bit of movement outside. And thank you. Just thank you for your time. Appreciate you, Meryl.
Look, I appreciate you as well. Have a great day.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of The Rebel Nutritionist. If you want more support and tips to help you go further with your own personal health journey, then become a Brandwine Rebel Insider. When you join my list, you'll get access to freebies such as meal planners, workshops, recipes, and so much more. Head over to brandwine.com/rebel and sign up there. I'll see you next week for another great episode. Bye for now.